I hope you're all doing well. Tonight I am going to be talking to you about Oodgeroo Noonuccal, who is an Aboriginal Australian poet. She was the first Aboriginal person to ever publish a collection of poetry, so she's really important. So I don't know anything about colonialism in Australia, honestly, beyond the usual, England and other countries colonized it, and were terrible to the natives, obviously, which is what always happens. So I had to do a bunch of research for this lecture, and I'm not sure how. I mean, this is not my wheelhouse, as y'all know. I didn't make this syllabus, so it doesn't have things that I'm an expert on it. So I tried my best here. So a lot of this comes from Encyclopedia Britannica. Some of it comes from this museum website. I got some of it from sources on EBSCO. So I'll just link some of the stuff that I used as source material. If you want to do further research, it's a really interesting history, and it's also interestingly difficult to find stuff on. Encyclopedia Britannica is usually a pretty good source, but for a lot of stuff about Aboriginal culture and history and colonialism in Australia, they still kind of gloss over the horrible stuff that Europeans did to Native Australians. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's still a pretty important social justice issue in Australia today, since it is difficult to find this information, and from a lot of the stuff I saw, it might not be taught in schools that much. I'm not sure. If you're Australian, let me know. I don't think any of you are Australian, but maybe you are. Maybe your family is. So okay. So pre-colonization, the population of Aboriginal Australians was estimated to have been between 300,000 and 1 million people. Traditionally, scholarship has regarded Aboriginal people to have been hunter-gatherers, but new research actually suggests that they probably had complex agricultural practices as well. Apparently, when the colonists got to Australia, it looked like a landscape that had been farmed. So they did probably have some advanced agriculture as well. They were nomadic, but had a strong tie to their homelands. Okay, so the Aboriginal worldview is pretty cool. So I'll spend some time on this. Find my thing here. Okay, so Aboriginal mythology of the beginning of the world and the earth focuses on something called the dreaming, or dream time, or the world dawn, which I think is cool. So the dreaming is a mythological period of time that had a beginning but no foreseeable end, during which the natural environment was shaped and humanized by the actions of mythic beings, many of whom took the form of humans or of animals, or changed forms throughout their time, their existence. They established the social order, and they established the social laws, and some of them created human life. So these mythical beings of the dreaming in Aboriginal belief are still alive today. They might have been turned into something else or gone somewhere else, but they're still alive today. So I think that's pretty interesting. So that would be the Aboriginal creation myth. It involves the past, present, and the future. So very universe infinitely expanding kind of as a mythology, which is also true, which is kind of cool. Let's see. So before Europeans came to Australia, there were more than 500 Aboriginal languages and most Aborigines were multilingual, and would have had like contact between their different like groups, I guess. So I guess from what I understand, like pre-colonization, they often lived in like small communities, but like once or twice a year they would all gather in like larger groups for different events, I guess. So when Europeans made contact, I should probably get a year on this. Sorry, I think it was the late 1600s. Okay, they began settling in 1788. So that was not the first time that Aboriginal people had encountered outsiders, but that was when the British came and decided to like settle Australia. It was 1788. So, as you are probably aware, the British like empire was super imperialist, which means that they just took over countries that they came to and instated their own governments, and usually like the native people suffered greatly and were taught that they were inferior to the white people who had come and like stolen their country. So their initial contact was friendly, but once they began expanding inland, the Europeans began expanding inland, they conflicted with the Aboriginal people. They took their land, they desecrated their sacred sites, they took their property, and so there were a lot of clashes. And apparently the Europeans viewed Aboriginal peoples as, quote, parasites on nature, and defined their culture in wholly negative terms. So very like dehumanizing view of Aboriginal people from the Europeans. Up until the 1880s, the European policy toward Aboriginal people was called pacification by force, which means they just killed them whenever they had the chance. So lots of Aboriginal people died in just this like genocide. Many others died of disease, or were left to fend for themselves outside of cities and towns. Basically were just like impoverished and cast out of this society that had been imposed upon their country. Alright, so by the time so in the late 1800s, like the Europeans essentially, because so many Aboriginal people had died at the hands of just like violence and also disease, the British basically were like decided that they were going to go extinct, and they put them in like they put them on reservations, or like I think they're called reserves, but similar to like the reservations in our country. They put them on reservations to essentially like wait for them to all die out. Many Aboriginal people were also like sold into slavery. There were like laws that said that Aboriginal children could be separated from their parents and sent to boarding schools where they had like their culture just like beaten out of them. Basically, they weren't allowed to speak their native languages. They weren't allowed to learn about their cultural history. So you know, a cultural genocide as well. They were kept off of their land. They couldn't survive because they couldn't hunt on their own land. So a really like brutal history. And so by the time Oodgeroo Noonuccal was born, she was born in 1920. So she lived through a time period where she and many other Aboriginal people like grew up in a somewhat traditional way, and witnessed the loss of that lifestyle over time. And so for her, poetry was very much like a political choice. Like she decided to write poetry so that she could give a voice to her people, and also like hopefully convince like settlers that they should be better to Aboriginal people. So, let's see. So I just want to read you guys this. So there were a lot of like laws that basically meant that like the Europeans were able to like interfere in Aboriginal affairs as much as they wanted. They weren't counted in the census also. They like weren't treated like citizens at all. So this comes from an Aboriginal Studies Museum, I think. Okay. So all states in Australia enforce special laws and protection policies for Aboriginal people. In practice, protection laws were shaped by prevailing attitudes of racial superiority and paternalism. So paternalism is the policy or practice on the part of people in positions of authority of restricting the freedom and responsibilities of those subordinate to them in the subordinate's supposed best interest. So the way that this looks in practice is, you know, something like, we are going to take over all the affairs of these native people because we know better, because we are more civilized and they are savages. So it's really shaped by this idea that like Aboriginal people could not possibly know what was best for them, and that they were inferior in every way to the British, or like the white Australians, I guess. So state governments severely controlled every aspect of Aboriginal people's lives, moving them from their homelands to live on reserves managed by Aborigine protection boards, protection officers, or native welfare officers. Children were forcibly removed from their families, people's movements and associations were controlled, and they were classified according to their descent. Across Australia, Aboriginal people suffered poor living conditions and poor health on many reserves and missions with substandard shelter or housing, meager rations, and poor education. Employment was controlled, often with rations for payment or wages withheld, and speaking language and other cultural practices were prohibited. Okay, so Oodgeroo Noonuccal wanted to give a voice to her people and fight back against colonial policies and also these colonial ideas of like white superiority over the native people of Australia. So Aboriginal people traditionally were non-literate, and instead their knowledge came from the oral tradition. Noonuccal felt that poetry would be an appropriate form to reach her people, and in a way, as like this really famous like Aboriginal poet, she enacts the traditional role of the storyteller, because so many of her poems tell of Aboriginal history, including the lost ways of the past, as well as the brutality of colonialism. So in a way, her work is actually writing down like the unwritten history of Aboriginal Australians. And it's also important to like keep in mind that like historically colonial, like Western colonial culture, so like England, just Europe generally, the United States, etc. Those cultures have valued the written word over the spoken word, and have basically said like if your culture didn't have writing in it, then it was an inferior culture. And that's not like inherently true, right? Like there are lots of cultures that do not have written like records, and instead people memorize them, right? Like it's just a different way of doing things. So for Aboriginal people, they kept track of their history and passed that history down through the oral tradition. And for Noonuccal, she saw poetry as like the closest written form to that oral tradition, because poetry is, you know, you're supposed to hear it, right? Like it's rhythmic, it's like, it's analogous to music, it's something that is, you know, comes alive off of the page. Okay. So the poem We Are Going shows an awareness that the voices of past generations have not been recorded in official histories. So it's a poem about loss, but there's also this discovery for the poet of all that she and her people are. So you'll notice this catalog. We belong here, we are of the old ways. We are the Corroboree and the ground. We are the old sacred ceremonies, the laws of the elders. We are the wonder tales of dream time, the tribal legends told. We are the past, the hunts and the laughing games, the wandering campfires. We are the lightning bolt over Gafemba Hill, quick and terrible, and the thunderer after him, that loud fellow. We are the quiet daybreak paling the dark lagoon. We are the shadow ghosts creeping back as the campfires burn low. We are nature and the past, all the old ways, gone now and scattered. So it's a really sad poem, right? I mean, she talks about all these things that are gone, and it's not just her people, it's also the animals that lived there too, right? Because obviously colonial influence is usually driven by profit at any cost, and the Europeans did not weren't big on taking care of the land. So the eagle is gone, the emu and the kangaroo are gone from this place, the Bora ring is gone, the corroboree is gone, and we are going. And we know from our footnote that the corroboree is, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but sorry, an Australian Aboriginal celebration held at night with songs and symbolic dances. So all of these things are gone, and her people are going. And I think something interesting to note about this poem is that typically colonial cultures and people from those cultures have seen a closeness to nature as a flaw in indigenous cultures, and instead she's celebrating that distinction, right? Yes, we are culturally closer to nature, and if the kangaroo and the emu go, we also go. Okay, so although their land has been taken, the poem still affirms the Aboriginal people as the true inhabitants of the land and the settlers as strangers. So we are as strangers here now, but the white tribe are the strangers. We belong here. We are of the old ways. So even though they're leaving, the land itself holds their memory, and they are still the rightful inhabitants of that land. And there's this sense that their physical presence isn't necessary to keep that distinction alive. Okay. So then we can talk about understand Old One. Okay, I also want to mention, so as I did kind of say, her use of written language was a political choice, and obviously did involve some giving in to colonial culture, because the very fact of using the written word and writing in English, that's taking, the tools of the oppressor. But she is taking the tools of the oppressor to hopefully change the oppressor's mind. She was definitely a political poet. And this also gave Aboriginal people a written record that would, I guess, allow them more respect within a European literary canon, which is what Australia was dominated by. So in an interview, Noonuccal said that she saw old Aboriginal men using the Bible at their meetings, and she wanted to give them a book that they could call their own. So this was the first time Aboriginals had a written voice, meaning a voice that would be valued by colonial standards. She transforms an unwritten history into a written one, and explicitly wrote to enact political change. And I should also mention that she was not born Oodgeroo Noonuccal. She wrote these poems originally under the name Kath Walker, and she took this Aboriginal name and forsook her colonizer name when she returned the member of the Order of the British Empire that she had received 17 years before 1987. So she returned it in 1987. She'd had it for 17 years. And she said she didn't want it anymore because of the crimes of the colonists, which she said were forbidding us our tribal language, the murders, the poisoning, the scalping, the denial of land custodianship, especially our spiritual sacred sites, the destruction of our sacred places, especially our burial grounds. So she redefined herself as, quote, Oodgeroo from the tribe of the Noonuccal, custodian of the lands that the white man calls Stradbroke Island and that the Aboriginal people call Minjerribah. And that comes from the Norton. Alright, so in Understand Old One, she enacts a very clear distinction between herself as an Aboriginal person and the colonial scientists. So even though these, I assume they're archaeologists, right? She says she wrote this as her note. This came after I had visited an old native burial ground not far from Brisbane, where university people were excavating bones and had invited me along. I wrote it down at once while impressions were still fresh. So she calls them university people, but like probably archaeologists, anthropologists, so people whose job it is to like study Aboriginal culture and who ostensibly should have some level of respect for it, but we see in the poem that's not exactly what's happening. So she aligns herself not with, quote, the learned ones, but with her ancestors who are buried in this burial ground. So historically, science has been somewhat disrespectful of burial customs of Native people. So she says here, the men of science coming with spade and knowledge, peer and probe, handle the yellow bones. For them specimens, to me more. Deeply moved am I. So she feels this connection to her ancestors and to her pre-colonial past. She says, it is with love I think of you so long ago laid here, with tears and wailing. Strongly I feel your presence very near, haunting the old spot, watching as we disturb your bones. And then she imagines what it would be like if her ancestors who were buried here were to come back and see like the world as it is in 1964. So she says, what if you came back now to our new world, the city roaring there on the old peaceful camping place, of your red fires along the quiet water, how you would wonder at towering stone gunyahs high in air, immense, incredible, planes in the sky over, swarms of cars like things frantic in flight. What if you came at night upon these miles of clustered neon lights of all colors, like Christian, newly come to his heaven or hell, and your own people gone? So I think that's a really cool image that she ends that stanza with, as if like a Christian going to heaven or hell and seeing all of their people gone is sort of the same thing. So she kind of like collapses this distinction of like these Christian afterlives and just imagines like one afterlife that people can go to in this way, which I think is kind of interesting. And she is also definitely like positioning the Christian people as like the other here, right? Like there's this we of the poet and her buried ancestors, and there's the they of like the Christians and the colonizers and the academics and the scientists who are like here disturbing this burial ground. So at the end she says, old one of the long ago, so many generations lie between us that cannot estrange, so she still feels connected. Your duty to your race was with the simple past. Mine lies in the present and the coming days. Almost reminds you a little bit of like Elizabeth Barrett Browning saying that poets should exert a double vision and look both forward and backward. So I think this is kind of interesting because to me, like the main question of this poem is like, why did she go with them? You know, like if she felt that this was desecrating like an ancestral burial ground. But I think the final stanza of the poem maybe gives us a potential answer to that question, which like I would ask what you guys thought if we were in class, but like we're not in class. So for her, she sees that to have a real like effect on the world as it is and to make the world better for her people, she needs to make some concessions to colonial culture. So perhaps that is why she would have gone to this burial ground, right? It's why she, probably why she writes in English, right? And then our final poem is called Municipal Gum, about a gum tree. So listen to how this poem sounds, because I think this poem is really formally interesting, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Gum tree in the city street, hard bitumen around your feet. Rather you should be in the cool world of leafy forest halls and wild bird calls. Here you seem to me like that poor cart horse, castrated, broken, a thing wronged, strapped and buckled, its hell prolonged, whose hung head and listless mien express its hopelessness. Municipal gum, it is dolorous to see you thus, set in your black grass of bitumen. O fellow citizen, what have they done to us? So, unlike the other poems, this kind of has a rhyme scheme. It doesn't have meter, as far as I can tell at least, but yeah, it doesn't have meter. So the rhyme scheme as I identified it here is like A, A, B, C, C, B, D, E, E, F, F, D, possibly, G, or D, I guess D. So dolorous and thus and horse, I'm saying like all rhyme here. Bitumen, which would be E, citizen, which is E, and then us, which is D again, and goes back with dolorous and thus. So it's almost written in couplets. There are a lot of rhyming couplets throughout this poem, but nothing that you could really identify as a formal, consistent rhyme scheme. And I think that makes sense, right? Because she obviously is not super interested in perpetuating, British colonial culture. So she probably doesn't find it particularly interesting to work in these poetic forms that were traditionally used by white people of the colonizing culture. So a theme that you'll see in this poem, as well as the last one we talked about, Understand Old One, is that she is aligning herself not with the colonists, but with the gum tree. So there's this kind of sense of the Aboriginal person and the Aboriginal poet as other in Australian society that you can see throughout her work. And she is other and different in the same way that a tree or a horse might be. So she looks at these other entities in society that surround her that she sees also experiencing a lot of disrespect at the hands of the settlers, white Australians, and she feels empathy for them and she aligns herself with them. So she's talking to a tree in this poem, and she says the tree should be in the cool world of leafy forest halls and wild bird calls. So she feels bad for the tree. She compares the tree to a horse that, a cart horse, like we have in the French Quarter, which we shouldn't, that's animal abuse, but okay. So castrated, broken, a thing wronged, strapped and buckled, its hell prolonged, whose hung head and listless mien express its hopelessness. So she spends a long time on the horse here, which I think is interesting. So, I'm pretty sure that there would not have been horses in Australia before the Europeans got there, but I can look that up. Where do horses come from? Okay, let's see. So horses, okay, they're from North America. They became extinct and were reintroduced by colonizing Europeans. So the horse is kind of like a symbol of European colonialism in a lot of ways. They had horses that they could use in war. I'm not a horse historian, but I know there's a connection between horses and colonial violence. So it's kind of interesting because although the horse was probably originally used as a tool of domination and imperialism against the Aboriginal people, she sees that the horse is also a victim of like colonial culture, right? Like this idea that like we are so superior to every other animal on earth, and every animal is just there for us to like use however we want, and also like animals can't suffer, only people can suffer. And she challenges that idea, right? Which is, you know, and her challenge is powerful. And she also is imagining that the tree can feel too. So the tree is a fellow citizen, and she says, what have they done to us? So you can think of her and the tree as citizens of like a different nation than, you know, Australia, which is a colonial nation. Okay. Let's see what else I want to say. So I guess the last thing I should talk about a little bit would be I did want to talk a little bit about like Aboriginal people in Australia today, but I seem to have X'd out of the page that had my notes on that. But basically, Aboriginal populations are back up to around 750,000. They make up about 3% of Australia's population. In 2008, the Australian government officially apologized to the Aboriginal people for, like, genocide. But they still experience poverty at much higher rates than, like, white Australians do, you know, in the same way as we see in our country with, like, Native Americans still suffer from policies that are no longer officially in place, but, you know, have long-term ramifications. So there's still a lot of work to be done in Australia. Okay, there's a lot more that can be said about Oodgeroo and Noonuccal too. She had a really interesting life. She was on a plane that got hijacked. But I think that is everything you need to know just in terms of like the poems that we're looking at and some of the context for those poems. So I hope that was reasonably informative and not too confusing. Yeah, so that's Oodgeroo and Noonuccal, and next time we will be talking about Gwen Harwood, who is also Australian, but not Aboriginal. Okay, I hope you guys are all doing well, staying safe. Semester's almost over, which will be nice. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.